Dylan Larkin asked for a trade back in June. It's now the middle of August, and he's still wearing a Detroit Red Wings sweater. Let's start with the basics. Larkin requested a trade out of Detroit back on June 4th. That's not a small deal. This is a homegrown captain, a player who's been the face of the franchise for a decade. Drafted 15th overall by the Red Wings back in 2014. Former general manager Steve Yzerman had the request in hand for weeks and simply never found an offer he was willing to accept. So instead of forcing a move, Yzerman stepped back from his day-to-day GM duties and moved into an advisory role. And that single decision changed everything about how this saga has played out. Here's the money piece that matters for Larkin personally. He's set to earn $8 million in actual salary this season, with an $8.7 million cap hit attached to his deal. If he decided to skip training camp entirely as a form of protest, he'd be walking away from that money. Given how much backlash he's already taken from parts of the fan base, most people around the situation don't expect him to make that kind of statement. He's expected to show up. That's the core tension here. Larkin wants out. Detroit hasn't found a trade worth making, and neither side has an obvious way to force the other's hand. It's also worth remembering how this whole thing became public in the first place. Insider Elliotte Friedman was the one who initially confirmed the request following the 2026 draft. Yzerman himself later acknowledged it directly, telling reporters that Larkin's agent had reached out shortly after the season ended, and that there was never any guarantee the request would actually be honored. That's an important detail, because it means Detroit never promised Larkin a trade. They only promised to listen. For months, Minnesota has been treated as the most realistic destination for Larkin. He reportedly approved the Wild as one of a small handful of teams he'd waive his no-move protection for. The problem isn't Larkin. The problem is what Minnesota actually has to offer. Longtime NHL insider Michael Russo summed up the issue pretty bluntly on a recent podcast appearance. He said, "I don't know how that deal is going to get done." His point was simple. Minnesota isn't going to hand over a core piece like Matt Boldy just to land Larkin. And Detroit isn't interested in taking a package built mostly around future assets and draft picks that aren't guaranteed to pan out. So where does that leave things? Russo raised the idea that the only realistic path might be a three-team trade, bringing in a third club that can supply the pieces Detroit actually wants, while Minnesota contributes something else to balance the deal. One name that keeps surfacing in these conversations is New Jersey, largely because of a completely separate storyline we're going to get into in a minute involving Minnesota's own roster. Bop line. Larkin has a preferred landing spot, but wanting to go somewhere and having the trade pieces to get there are two very different problems. Right now, Minnesota simply doesn't have enough in the cupboard to make Detroit say yes. Minnesota isn't actually the only team Larkin has cleared for a potential move. Reporting throughout the summer indicates he initially approved a small group of 4 organizations he'd be willing to waive his protection for. Here's where it gets more complicated. 2 of those teams have reportedly cooled off entirely, which is part of why Minnesota has become the default focus of this whole conversation. That leaves a shorter list that still includes San Jose, Montreal, and Utah as theoretical fits, alongside New Jersey and Minnesota. Florida is a name that keeps coming up too, mostly because of speculation rather than confirmation. Former Red Wings defenseman Carlo Koliakovo, now working as an insider for TSN, made an interesting point on the subject. His reasoning was that if a Larkin to Florida trade were realistic, it probably would have already happened, given how far along other Panthers-related conversations have moved this summer. The bigger issue for Larkin personally is that he's been unwilling to expand his list any further. He's staying patient, waiting for one of his approved teams to make a real move, rather than opening the door to destinations he hasn't pre-cleared. That patience is admirable in one sense, but it's also part of why this has dragged on for over 2 months without resolution. Here's what makes this whole situation even messier. Detroit doesn't currently have a general manager who can actually make a trade. Since Yzerman stepped into his advisory position, assistant GM Sean Horkoff has been running the day-to-day operation. But Horkoff doesn't have the authority to sign players or execute trades. So even if the perfect Larkin offer landed on the desk tomorrow, there's genuinely nobody in Detroit's front office empowered to say yes to it. Owner Chris Ilitch brought in an outside search firm to run the hiring process. and insider Elliot Friedman gave an update on where that stands. He explained that the team is being very deliberate about it, telling reporters that Detroit wants candidates to know they have full autonomy. Translation: ownership wants whoever takes this job to actually run hockey operations, not share the role with Yzerman in any capacity. That search reportedly started its formal interview process in the second week of August. Names that have circulated include internal candidates already inside the organization, along with outside executives from other successful front offices around the league. A mix that reportedly includes assistant GMs from cup-contending teams and at least one executive currently working outside hockey entirely within the same ownership group. But here's the practical issue. Training camp opens September 17th. That gives a brand new general manager an extremely short runway to walk in, learn the roster, evaluate trade offers, and make a franchise-altering decision about their own captain, all within a matter of weeks. Realistically, that timeline is a big reason why so many people around the league now expect Larkin to open the season still in Detroit, with the trade conversation picking back up closer to the March deadline instead. Now let's talk about why Minnesota's own defenseman keeps getting pulled into this conversation, even though it's really a separate story on its own. Quinn Hughes has 1 year left on his current contract, and Minnesota wants to lock him up long-term. They've reportedly been willing to go as long as 5 to 8 years. But Hughes appears to want something much shorter, and the reasoning behind it has nothing to do with money and everything to do with family. His brother Jack Hughes plays for New Jersey, under contract through the 2030 season. A 3-year extension would make Quinn a free agent that exact same summer, opening the door for the two brothers to potentially choose their next team together, with their younger brother Luke Hughes already locked into New Jersey through 2032. This matters for the Larkin situation because if Quinn Hughes ever signals he's not planning to stay in Minnesota beyond this deal, the Wild would have real motivation to move him before he simply walks away for nothing in return. And that's exactly the kind of scenario that could open the door to the 3-team trade structure we talked about earlier, potentially involving New Jersey, Minnesota, and Detroit all at once. Nothing there is settled. Hughes hasn't made a final decision, and Minnesota's front office is still actively working to convince him to commit longer term. It's a subplot worth watching closely because it directly affects what Minnesota can and can't offer in any Larkin conversation. So let's pull all of this together. Larkin wants a trade. Minnesota is his preferred fit, but they don't currently have the assets Detroit wants. Detroit doesn't even have a general manager in place who can approve a deal. And the one player who could theoretically unlock a bigger 3-team trade, Quinn Hughes, hasn't decided his own future yet. That's 4 moving pieces, and right now, none of them are close to lining up. The most likely short-term outcome, based on everything currently being reported, is Larkin reporting to Red Wings training camp in September, still wearing the winged wheel, with this entire situation getting revisited once Detroit finally has a permanent decision-maker in place. To recap, Larkin remains in Detroit for now, with no GM in place to move him. His approved list of destinations has already shrunk once this summer. Minnesota wants him but lacks the pieces to get a deal done on their own. And Quinn Hughes' contract decision could end up shaping how this entire situation eventually resolves, whether that's this season or closer to next year's deadline.